Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you grateful for modern military life, even if you've never served a day. We're diving into what it was actually like to be a soldier back when comfort wasn't just an afterthought. It was a concept that hadn't been invented yet, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're a soldier in an ancient army, standing in a field somewhere between exhaustion and terror. Your feet hurt, your stomach growls, your armour chafes in places you didn't know could chafe, and the closest thing to a complaint department is your commanding officer, who solves problems by yelling louder or occasionally hitting people with sticks. Welcome to military life before anyone realised soldiers were, human beings who might benefit from things like adequate food, shelter, or the revolutionary concept of not dying from easily preventable diseases. For most of human history, armies operated on a very simple principle. Get a bunch of men together, point them at the enemy, and hope enough of them survive to declare victory. What happened to those men between battles? How they slept? What they ate? Whether they had functioning limbs by the end of the campaign? These were details that commanders rarely lost sleep over. Soldiers were replaceable. Comfort was expensive. And the idea that keeping your troops healthy might actually improve their fighting ability, well, that took a surprisingly long time to catch on. This wasn't just ancient history either. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, soldiers were treated with about as much care as the muskets they carried. Actually, scratch that. The muskets usually got better treatment. A broken rifle was expensive to replace. A dead soldier, just recruit another farm boy who doesn't know any better. So tonight, we're going to walk through the grim, uncomfortable, often darkly hilarious reality of military life before modern reforms. We'll visit Roman legions marching through mud with blistered feet. We'll sit in medieval encampments where hygiene was a suggestion, and disease killed more men than swords ever did. We'll shiver in Napoleonic bivouacs where soldiers froze to death within sight of their officers' warm tents. And we'll watch as century after century, armies slowly, painfully, reluctantly came to understand that maybe, just maybe, soldiers perform better when they're not constantly miserable. This is the story of military discomfort. The long, cold, hungry, lice-infested march toward the radical idea that soldiers deserve basic human dignity. Spoiler alert, it took a very long time. Let's start with the Roman legions, because if there's one thing history teachers love to romanticize, it's Roman military efficiency. Oh, the discipline, the organization, the engineering marvels of their camps. And yes, compared to many ancient armies, Roman soldiers had it relatively good. But relatively good in the ancient world still meant a level of hardship that would make modern recruits weep into their MREs. A Roman legionary was expected to march up to 20 miles a day while carrying roughly 60 to 80 pounds of equipment. Not in a comfortable backpack with padded straps and weight distribution designed by sports scientists. No, this was gear strapped onto a wooden pole called a sarcina, slung over one shoulder like the world's most painful bindle. Your armour, your tools, your cooking pot, your tent stakes, several days' worth of grain, and whatever personal items you'd been foolish enough to bring, all bouncing against your back with every step. The standard footwear was the caliga, a heavy sandal with an iron-studded sole. Sounds sturdy, right? It was, until you marched through mud, snow, or rocky terrain for weeks on end. Blisters were universal, foot infections common, and if you couldn't keep up with the march because your feet had swollen into bloody messes, well, that was your problem. Fall behind, and you might be flogged for malingering. Or worse, you'd be left behind for real, easy prey for local tribes who weren't fond of Roman occupation. The Romans loved to talk about their road network, those beautiful straight highways cutting across the empire. And yes, when you marched on actual Roman roads, life was marginally better. But most campaigns took legions far from those roads, through forests, across rivers, over mountain passes where there was nothing but mud, rocks, and the occasional bear wondering why several thousand armoured men were trampling through its territory. Food was another adventure in discomfort. The Roman army's diet centred on grain, mostly wheat or barley, which each soldier ground himself into flour using a hand mill. Then you baked it into hard, dense bread over whatever fire you could scrape together. No ovens, no professional bakers, just you, some grain, and the fading hope of ever tasting something that wasn't vaguely bread-shaped. Soldiers supplemented this thrilling menu with bacon-fat, sour wine called posca, and if they were lucky, whatever they could forage, steal, or buy from local populations who definitely weren't being extorted. Definitely not. The posca deserves special mention. This was the standard drink of the Roman military, a mixture of water and sour wine or vinegar. It sounds disgusting, and by all accounts, it was. But it had one advantage. The acidity killed some of the bacteria in questionable water sources. So soldiers drank it, not because it tasted good, but because it was marginally less likely to give you dysentery than straight river water. The bar for beverage quality was remarkably low. Meat was a luxury, usually reserved for special occasions or when the army had just finished looting somewhere prosperous. Most of the time it was bread, more bread, and for variety, bread prepared slightly differently. Scurvy was common on long campaigns, so was general malnutrition. Soldiers learned to recognise edible plants and supplemented their diet with whatever they could find: mushrooms, berries, wild onions. Of course, sometimes they got this wrong, and a whole unit would spend the night violently ill because someone mistook hemlock for something edible. As for sleeping arrangements, Roman soldiers built marching camps almost every night. An impressive feat of engineering that involved digging ditches, raising ramparts, and pitching leather tents. Inside those tents, 8 men shared a space roughly the size of a modern bedroom. 8. They slept on the ground, on whatever bedding they carried, which was usually a thin blanket if they had one at all. In winter, they huddled together for warmth. In summer, they sweltered. And throughout, they lived with the knowledge that the guy snoring next to them probably hadn't bathed in weeks. The tent itself was made of heavy leather, which kept out rain when it was new, but developed leaks after a few campaigns. Replacing tent sections was difficult and expensive, so soldiers often slept under dripping leather, trying to position themselves under the dry spots while water pooled around them. The tent had no floor, just bare earth that turned to mud when it rained. In winter, that mud froze solid. In summer, it crawled with insects. Hygiene was optional at best. Soldiers washed when they had access to rivers or streams, which wasn't always. Latrines were communal, and often just trenches dug at the camp's edge. Privacy didn't exist, neither did toilet paper. Romans used sponges on sticks, which they shared. Yes, shared. If that doesn't make you appreciate modern plumbing, nothing will. The sponge on a stick situation, by the way, wasn't just unhygienic, it was actively dangerous. Infections spread rapidly, intestinal parasites were universal, and the Romans, despite their famous aqueducts and bathhouses back in Rome, apparently never made the connection between shared toilet sponges and the mysterious diseases that swept through military camps. Bathing, when it happened, was a group activity in whatever river or stream was nearby. No soap, just cold water and aggressive scrubbing. In winter, this was an ordeal that left men shivering for hours afterward. Many simply chose not to bathe at all, which meant the average Roman legion probably smelled like a combination of unwashed bodies, leather, smoke, and horse manure. Quite the olfactory experience. And yet, for all this discomfort, Roman soldiers were expected to maintain perfect discipline. Any complaint could be interpreted as insubordination. Any hesitation in battle could result in decimation. A punishment where 1 in every 10 men in a disgraced unit was beaten to death by his comrades. The Romans didn't believe in morale-boosting pep talks. They believed in fear, routine, and the understanding that your life was expendable. The decimation process, incidentally, was designed to be as psychologically devastating as possible. The condemned men weren't executed by strangers or officers. They were clubbed to death by their own tent mates, the men they'd marched beside, eaten with, and slept next to. This ensured that everyone in the unit carried the trauma of that punishment forever, morale building at its finest. Still, Roman legionaries had some advantages over soldiers in other eras. They were paid, albeit irregularly and often in currency that had been debased so many times it was barely worth the metal it was stamped on. They received land grants upon retirement, assuming they survived 25 years of service, which many didn't. The average life expectancy of a legionary was considerably shorter than a civilian's, and that's in a world where living to 40 was considered a decent run. And the Roman military machine, for all its brutality, at least functioned with a degree of organisation. Supplies were supposed to reach the troops, even if they often didn't. Medical care existed in the form of field hospitals, even if the treatment was mostly apply wine to wound and hope for the best. Compared to what came after, the Roman military was a model of soldier welfare, which should tell you something about what came after. When the Roman Empire collapsed, so did most of its military infrastructure. What followed were centuries of fragmented, chaotic, deeply uncomfortable warfare where the concept of a professional standing army largely disappeared. Medieval soldiers, especially during the early Middle Ages, were often little more than armed peasants dragged from their fields by feudal obligation and told to fight for lords they'd never met over causes they didn't understand. Let's talk about the average foot soldier in a medieval army. If you were a peasant levy, and most soldiers were, you weren't issued standardised equipment. You brought whatever you had. A rusty spear your grandfather used, a wooden shield that might stop one good blow if you were lucky, leather armour if you could afford it, which you probably couldn't. Most men fought in their everyday tunics, which offered about as much protection as a strong opinion. The concept of military supply simply didn't exist for common soldiers. You were told when and where to assemble, and you showed up with whatever weapons and armour you could scrape together. If you couldn't afford a sword, you brought a farm implement. Pitchforks, scythes, wood-cutting axes. Medieval battlefields were full of men wielding tools that were never designed for combat, hoping desperately that they wouldn't have to actually use them. Nobles and knights, of course, had real armour. Chainmail, plate armour, war horses, squires to carry their stuff. They looked impressive and survived longer. Meanwhile, you, the peasant with a pointy stick, were expected to stand in formation and not run away when armoured cavalry charged directly at you. Good luck with that. The social divide between knights and common soldiers was astronomical. Knights were professionals who trained for combat from childhood. They had expensive equipment, years of experience, and the confidence that came from knowing they were worth ransoming if captured. Common soldiers had none of these advantages. They were cannon fodder, except cannons hadn't been invented yet, so they were arrow fodder, sword fodder, horse trampling fodder. Marching conditions were medieval in every sense of the word. Armies moved slowly, often just 10 to 15 miles a day because roads were terrible when they existed at all. Most of the time, you trudged through mud, forded rivers without bridges, and climbed hills that seemed specifically designed to break human legs. Your feet, wrapped in cloth or shoved into crude leather shoes, were perpetually wet, cold, and falling apart. Trenchfoot wasn't called that yet, but soldiers definitely had it. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of forests, swamps, and poorly maintained paths. Armies moved like slow-motion disasters, leaving trails of destruction wherever they went. The column of marching men stretched for miles, a chaotic mix of soldiers, camp followers, supply wagons that constantly broke down, livestock being driven to slaughter, and merchants hoping to sell overpriced goods to desperate men. Food was a constant problem. Medieval armies rarely carried sufficient supplies. Instead, they foraged, which is a polite way of saying they stole everything edible from the countryside they passed through. Villagers hid their grain, buried their livestock, and fled into the woods when they heard an army was coming. Not because of the enemy, but because any army, friendly or hostile, would strip the land bare. Soldiers ate stale bread, dried peas, whatever they could hunt or scavenge. Many went hungry for days. Starvation killed more medieval soldiers than battle ever did. The foraging system created a vicious cycle. Armies moved through a region, taking everything. This created famine among the local population, which meant there was nothing left to take when the army returned. So armies had to keep moving, always searching for fresh territory to plunder. The longer a war lasted, the larger the area of devastation grew. Some regions took generations to recover from a single campaign. And the camps. Oh, the camps. There was no Roman-style organisation here. Medieval armies often just stopped wherever evening caught them. Soldiers slept on the ground, sometimes under crude tents made from their own cloaks. More often under nothing at all. If it rained, you got wet. If it was cold, you shivered. Fires were built if wood was available, but fuel was often scarce, especially after thousands of men had already picked. The area clean, camp security was minimal. A few sentries posted around the perimeter, usually half asleep because they'd marched all day and had no energy left for vigilance. Night attacks were common and devastating. An enemy force could sweep through a sleeping camp, killing hundreds before anyone organised a defence. Soldiers slept with their weapons close, knowing they might need to fight at any moment. Hygiene was a distant memory. Soldiers didn't bathe. They didn't wash their clothes. Lice were universal companions. Fleas hopped from man to man like tiny plague vectors, which incidentally they sometimes were. Disease spread through camps with horrifying speed. Dysentery, typhus, cholera, mysterious fevers. Medical knowledge was virtually non-existent. If you got sick, your comrades moved your body to the edge of camp so you wouldn't disturb anyone while you died. The medieval understanding of disease was based on the theory of humours, the idea that illness came from an imbalance of bodily fluids. Treatment involved bloodletting, which weakened already sick men. Herbal remedies helped sometimes, if the herbalist actually knew what they were doing. But most camp healers were charlatans or well-meaning amateurs who did more harm than good. Imagine being a foot soldier in the 100 Years' War. You've been marching for weeks. Your feet are raw. Your stomach is empty. You haven't seen your family in months and you have no idea when or if you'll return. Then you arrive at a battlefield, stand in a muddy field, and wait while arrows rain down from the sky. If you survive, congratulations. You get to march somewhere else and do it all over again. The lack of comfort wasn't an oversight. It was simply how things were. Feudal lords didn't think about soldier welfare because soldiers were peasants, and peasants were expected to suffer. That was their role in the social order. Comfort was for the nobility. Common soldiers existed to absorb arrows, hold ground, and die when necessary. Even knights, with all their privilege, weren't exactly comfortable. Yes, they had better armour and horses, but that armour weighed 40 to 60 pounds and turned into an oven in summer, or an icebox in winter. Knights slept in their armour during campaigns, because taking it off and putting it back on was exhausting. They developed saddle sores from days in the saddle, and if they fell off their horse in battle, getting back up in full plate armour was nearly impossible. Many drowned in shallow streams simply because they couldn't lift themselves out of the water. The famous Battle of Agincourt included a lesser-known tragedy. After the battle, French knights who had fallen in the mud were trampled by their own retreating forces. The combination of heavy armour and soft ground created a death trap. Men suffocated face down in mud, unable to push themselves up. It was an ignoble end for warriors who had spent their lives training for glorious combat. Medieval warfare was brutal, chaotic, and profoundly uncomfortable for everyone involved, and it stayed that way for centuries, because nobody with power saw any reason to change it. By the time we reached the 16th and 17th centuries, armies were getting larger, gunpowder was changing warfare, and you'd think maybe, just maybe, military planners would start caring about soldier welfare. You'd be wrong. If anything, conditions got worse because armies grew so massive that feeding, housing, and supplying them became logistically impossible. Take the 30 Years' War, one of Europe's most devastating conflicts. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands crisscrossed Central Europe, leaving famine, plague, and destruction in their wake. Soldiers weren't paid regularly. Sometimes they went months without wages. To survive, they plundered. Entire regions were stripped bare. Villages were burned, civilians were terrorized, and the soldiers themselves lived like locusts, devouring everything, then moving on to the next area. The phrase, living off the land, sounds almost pastoral, like soldiers were peacefully farming and hunting. The reality was systematic theft and violence. Soldiers kicked down doors, took everything of value, and moved on. If villagers resisted, they were killed. If they cooperated, they were left alive but destitute. Either way, the army moved on, caring nothing for the devastation left behind. These armies marched in massive, disorganized columns that stretched for miles. There was no supply chain in the modern sense. Soldiers carried what they could and stole the rest. Imagine marching with 30,000 other men, all of whom are hungry, cold, and desperate. Fights broke out constantly. Men deserted at every opportunity. Discipline was maintained through brutal punishments, flogging, branding, hanging. Commanders ruled through fear because there was no other way to control such large, miserable groups. Desertion was a massive problem. Some estimates suggest that 25 to 40% of soldiers in 17th century armies deserted at some point. Can you blame them? You're not being paid, you're starving, your feet are rotting, and you're being marched toward a battle where you'll probably die. Walking away starts to look pretty reasonable, but desertion was punished with extreme violence when caught. Men were hanged in front of their units as a warning. Some were forced to run the gauntlet, walking between two lines of soldiers who beat them with sticks and fists. Many didn't survive. The message was clear: dying in battle was preferable to the punishment for trying to escape. The camps were nightmares. Tens of thousands of men, plus camp followers, wives, children, merchants, prostitutes, all crammed into makeshift settlements with no sanitation. Latrines overflowed. Garbage piled up. Disease was inevitable. Typhus, dysentery and plague swept through camps regularly, killing thousands. Soldiers didn't die heroically in battle. They died shivering in mud, delirious, with fever, surrounded by other dying men. Camp followers deserve their own mention. Every major army was accompanied by an almost equal number of non-combatants. These were mostly women and children, families of soldiers who had nowhere else to go. They provided essential services, cooking, washing, nursing, but they also suffered the same hardships as the soldiers. They marched the same distances, endured the same cold and hunger, and died from the same diseases. Their presence made the camps even more crowded and unsanitary, but they were essential to the army's functioning. Medical care was medieval, literally. Army surgeons were often barbers or butchers with no formal training. If you were wounded, your treatment options were amputation without anaesthesia, or doing nothing and hoping you didn't die from infection. Most men chose the latter. At least that way they kept their limbs until gangrene took them anyway. Surgery in this era was a horror show. The surgeon's primary tool was a saw. Anaesthesia didn't exist, so patients were held down by multiple men while the surgeon worked as quickly as possible. Speed was essential because the pain was so intense that many patients went into shock and died on the table. If you survived the surgery, infection usually killed you within a week. Survival rates for amputations were perhaps 25% on a good day. Food was a cruel joke. Soldiers received rations when supply trains arrived, which wasn't often. The rations themselves were usually mouldy bread, spoiled meat, and watered-down beer. Scurvy was common. Malnutrition weakened everyone. Men became too sick to fight long before they saw a battlefield. The beer deserves mention because water was often so contaminated that drinking it meant certain illness. Beer was safer because the brewing process killed some bacteria. But the beer issued to soldiers was weak, often sour and sometimes spoiled. Still, it was better than the alternative, which was drinking from rivers that served as open sewers for the entire army. And the cold. Wars didn't stop for winter, so armies campaigned year-round. Soldiers marched through snow in inadequate clothing. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, ears. Men froze to death on sentry duty. Inside tents, if you were lucky enough to have one, the cold was only slightly less lethal. Fires provided minimal warmth and filled tents with smoke. You chose between freezing or suffocating. Winter campaigns were particularly brutal because most soldiers came from regions where winters were relatively mild. They had no experience with extreme cold and no equipment to deal with it. Their wool uniforms provided some insulation when dry, but once wet, wool became heavy and useless. Many soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets or stolen furs, creating bizarre hybrid outfits that looked ridiculous but kept them marginally warmer. The 17th century also saw the rise of more formal military ranks and structure. But this didn't translate into better treatment for common soldiers. Officers lived separately, ate better food, and enjoyed privileges that foot soldiers could only dream of. The gap between officers and enlisted men was a chasm. Officers were often noblemen who purchased their commissions. They saw soldiering as a path to glory and advancement. The men they commanded were expendable resources, barely human in their eyes. This attitude persisted even as armies modernized. When muskets became standard, soldiers stood in tight formations, firing volleys at close range. This required discipline and courage, but it also required men willing to stand still while being shot at. Commanders achieved this through relentless drilling and savage punishments. A soldier who broke ranks could be executed on the spot. Fear of your own officers often exceeded fear of the enemy. The 18th century brought even larger armies and even more regimented warfare. This was the age of Frederick the Great, of elaborate uniforms, of battles that looked like choreographed dances of death. Surely you'd think this era cared more about soldiers. Again, no. Let's focus on the armies of the Napoleonic Wars because they represent both the peak of pre-modern military organisation and the depths of soldier suffering. Napoleon's Grande Armée was a marvel of logistics and strategy. It conquered most of Europe. It also chewed through men like a meat grinder, caring nothing for their comfort or survival. If French infantrymen in Napoleon's army marched constantly, campaigns covered hundreds of miles. The pace was brutal, often 15 to 20 miles a day, sometimes more. Stragglers were left behind. If you couldn't keep up, you were on your own, easy prey for enemy patrols or hostile locals. Napoleon's military philosophy emphasized speed and aggression. He believed rapid movement could compensate for smaller numbers and catch enemies off guard. He was right, strategically. But this speed was purchased with the bodies of his soldiers. Men marched until their feet bled, until they collapsed from exhaustion, until they simply couldn't take another step. Soldiers carried everything on their backs: musket, ammunition, spare shoes if they had them, a blanket, a cooking pot, and a few days' worth of bread. The load was heavy. The march was endless. Men's feet bled. Their backs ached. They kept moving because stopping meant punishment or death. The famous image of Napoleon's soldiers in their blue coats and tall hats is somewhat misleading. Those uniforms looked impressive on parade, but they were poorly suited for campaign life. The coats were heavy when wet, the hats offered no protection from sun or cold, and the boots fell apart after weeks of marching. Soldiers spent much of their time trying to repair or replace worn-out equipment with whatever they could find. Food was theoretically provided by supply wagons, but in practice soldiers foraged. They raided farms, stole livestock, dug up root vegetables from frozen fields. When Napoleon invaded Russia, his army found villages already burned and emptied by retreating Russians. There was nothing to forage. Men starved, horses died. The army began to disintegrate from hunger before the Russian winter even arrived, and then winter came. The 1812 retreat from Moscow is one of history's greatest disasters. Napoleon's army, once over 600,000 strong, was reduced to fewer than 100,000 survivors. Most didn't die in battle. They froze. They starved. They collapsed from exhaustion and were left in the snow. The retreat from Moscow wasn't a military operation. It was a death march. The army lost all organisation. Units dissolved as men simply wandered westward, hoping to find safety. Supply wagons were abandoned. Artillery was left in the snow. Soldiers threw away their weapons because they were too weak to carry them. Soldiers wore wool uniforms designed for European summers, not Russian winters. They wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: blankets, stolen coats, rags. It wasn't enough. Frostbite claimed thousands. Men lost toes, feet, fingers. Some went mad from cold and wandered away from the columns, never to be seen again. The wounded were the most pitiable. Unable to walk, they begged passing soldiers for help. But everyone was too weak, too focused on their own survival to help. Wounded men were left sitting in the snow, knowing they would freeze to death within hours. Some were killed by Russian Cossacks who harassed the retreat. Others simply closed their eyes and never woke up. At night, the army tried to camp, but there was no shelter. Men huddled around fires built from furniture looted from abandoned homes. They burned wagons, books, anything flammable. Still, they froze. Sentries fell asleep at their posts and died standing up, frozen solid. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers fought each other over scraps of food. Officers abandoned their men. The retreat became a chaotic rout where survival was the only goal. Those who made it back to France were shadows of their former selves, physically and mentally broken. But here's the thing. This disaster was avoidable. Better planning, better supply lines, warmer clothing, winter shelters. All of this was possible. But Napoleon prioritised speed and aggression over logistics and soldier welfare. His army paid the price. Even in less catastrophic campaigns, Napoleonic soldiers lived hard lives. Camps were cold, wet, and filthy. Soldiers slept on the ground with a single blanket. Latrines were pits that overflowed constantly. Lice were so common that soldiers held competitions to see who could catch the most. The lice weren't just annoying. They carried typhus, which killed more soldiers than Russian muskets did. Typhus outbreaks swept through armies regularly, turning camps into charnel houses. The disease caused high fever, delirium, and a characteristic rash. Most victims died within a week. There was no treatment and no understanding of how it spread. Medical care improved slightly during this era. Army surgeons were more skilled, and hospitals were established behind the lines. But battlefield medicine was still brutal. Amputations were common. Anesthesia didn't exist. Soldiers bit down on leather straps while surgeons sawed through bone. Infection killed most surgical patients within days. Field hospitals were grim places. Wounded men lay on blood-soaked straw, waiting for treatment that might never come. The smell of gangrene filled the air. Surgeons moved from patient to patient without washing their hands or instruments, spreading infection. Many soldiers preferred to die on the battlefield rather than endure the horrors of the hospital. The Napoleonic Wars also saw the rise of conscription. Entire populations were drafted into military service. Young men, often teenagers, were torn from their families and thrown into armies with minimal training. They learned to fight by fighting. Many died in their first battle, never having fired a shot. Despite all this suffering, morale was maintained through a combination of propaganda, camaraderie, and nationalism. Soldiers believed they were fighting for glory, for France, for Napoleon himself. This belief carried them through unimaginable hardship, but it didn't make them comfortable. By the mid-19th century, cracks finally began to appear in the old system. The Crimean War, fought in the 1850s, exposed just how badly armies treated their soldiers. British troops, fighting in the freezing Crimean winter, died in shocking numbers from disease, starvation, and exposure. Not because they were losing battles, but because their own military couldn't supply them with basic necessities. Florence Nightingale famously brought attention to the horrific conditions in British military hospitals. Wounded soldiers lay in filth, without bandages, without medicine, dying from infections that simple hygiene could have prevented. Her reforms saved thousands of lives and forced the British military to confront its own incompetence. Nightingale's most important contribution wasn't medical knowledge, it was basic sanitation. She insisted that hospitals be cleaned, that bedding be washed, that wounds be bandaged with clean cloth. These simple measures reduced death rates dramatically. The British military establishment initially resisted her reforms, insisting that such measures were unnecessary and expensive. It took public outrage to force change. Similarly, the American Civil War revealed the cost of ignoring soldier welfare. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Disease killed twice as many soldiers as combat. Soldiers lived in trenches, enduring rain, mud, and constant bombardment. Yet even in this war, rations were irregular, medical care was primitive, and comfort was non-existent. The Civil War introduced new horrors, trench warfare that would foreshadow World War I. Soldiers lived in muddy trenches for months, surrounded by rats, lice, and the constant threat of sniper fire. They endured artillery bombardments that lasted hours, leaving men deaf and shell-shocked. The psychological toll was immense, though it wouldn't be recognised or treated for decades. But something was changing. Journalists and photographers documented the suffering. The public saw images of wounded soldiers and squalid camps. For the first time, civilian populations demanded better treatment for their armies. Governments slowly and reluctantly began to respond. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the first real reforms. Soldiers received standardised uniforms, rations improved, medical care advanced with antiseptics and anaesthesia. Barracks replaced tents. Organised supply chains ensured food and ammunition reached the front lines. These reforms didn't come from kindness, they came from necessity. Modern wars required trained soldiers who could operate complex equipment. Dead soldiers couldn't be easily replaced, and sick soldiers couldn't fight. Militaries finally understood that soldier welfare was strategic, not charitable. World War I was still brutal, with trench warfare creating new horrors. But soldiers had boots that fit, coats that were warm, and food that was edible. They had medics trained in modern techniques. They had letters from home and organised leave schedules. It wasn't luxury, but it was progress. The trenches of World War I were hellish, but they represented a turning point. For the first time, armies made systematic efforts to care for soldiers' psychological health. Shell shock was recognised as a real condition, even if treatment was primitive. Soldiers received regular hot meals even in the front lines. Rotation systems ensured men weren't left in combat for extended periods. World War II continued the trend. Armies invested in soldier welfare because they finally understood that healthy, well-fed, reasonably comfortable soldiers fought better. Hot meals, real beds in rest areas, medical evacuations, psychiatric care. These things existed because militaries realised that men were not expendable. Today, modern soldiers still face hardship, but they have gear designed by engineers, rations that are nutritious, medical care that saves lives, and systems in place to address their needs. They're treated as valuable assets, even as human beings. It took thousands of years, but militaries finally learned the lesson. For most of human history, soldiers were expected to endure without question. Cold, hunger, disease, exhaustion, these were just part of the job. Complaining was weakness, suffering was expected, comfort was for the weak. We look back now and wonder how anyone survived. How did Roman legionaries march 20 miles a day carrying crushing loads? How did medieval foot soldiers stand in muddy fields waiting to die? How did Napoleonic troops endure the Russian winter? The answer is simple and heartbreaking. They had no choice. Most didn't survive. Disease killed more soldiers than battle in every war. Before the 20th century, starvation, exposure, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. The survivors were those lucky enough, tough enough, or stubborn enough to outlast the suffering. But they were still human. They still felt cold, hunger, pain. They still dreamed of home, of warm beds, of full bellies. They still wrote letters, told jokes around campfires, and formed bonds with the men beside them. Comfort may not have existed, but humanity did. The shift toward caring about soldier welfare didn't come from kindness. It came from necessity. Wars became too large, too expensive, too dependent on trained soldiers to waste lives through negligence. Militaries that treated soldiers well won wars. Those that didn't, lost. Today, we take for granted that soldiers should have adequate food, shelter, medical care, and rest. We expect their gear to work, their leaders to care, and their sacrifices to be honoured. But for thousands of years, none of this existed. Soldiers were disposable, their comfort was irrelevant. Understanding this history doesn't diminish modern soldiers' hardships. It simply reminds us how far we've come and how recently we've arrived. The idea that soldiers deserve basic dignity is a modern invention. For most of history, they had to fight without it. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm bed, with a full stomach and no one threatening to flog you for complaining, spare a thought for the countless soldiers who marched through mud, froze in the snow and died far from home, all without anyone caring whether they were comfortable. Their suffering built the world we live in. The least we can do is remember it.